Good morning, welcome back to the show. 10:34 is the time. I'm Julia Hartley-Brewer. Sam Armstrong's still with us. Joined now by Brendan O'Neill. He's the chief political writer at Spiked Online. He's also author of the brilliant book, After the Pogrom, 7th of October, Israel and the Crisis of Civilization. Very good morning to you, Brendan.
Hi, Julia.
Thanks for joining us. Well, I mean, you know, are we in a crisis of civilization when a load of, nice people at Glastonbury, all on the left, all with their little Palestine flags, shout, death, death to the IDF?
Yes, absolutely. You know, we have to be really honest about what death to the IDF means. It means death to Jewish soldiers. You know, the IDF is not entirely Jewish, but is predominantly Jewish. We all know that it is charged with protecting the Jewish homeland from the armies of anti-Semites that surround it. So if these people got their way, if their dream that they grossly chanted for at Glastonbury, if that dream were to come true, it would lead to the destruction of the Jewish state and the untold death of Jewish people. And some of them will say, well, we didn't know that, we weren't thinking about that. Well, you know, to borrow a phrase they like to use, educate yourselves, learn about what this means. And I think it's horrific. I think it's genuinely horrific. To me, it felt like a fascist rally. We haven't seen anything like this since the British Union of Fascists in the 1930s, when you have a group of privileged kids in a field chanting for the death of the army of the Jewish nation. That's something that we've got to take very seriously.
I thought it was very interesting. One of his other chants that was, again, I do sound like an elderly judge when I read this out like this, but heard you want your country back, shut the F up, you can't have your country back. I thought what an interesting comparison, as a compare and contrast with their views over Palestine and their views over the nation state they believe the Palestinian people are entitled to, but apparently not that keen on it when it comes to Britain.
Absolutely. You know, the Palestinians can have a state, which, by the way, is a view that many of us share. But the Jews can't have a homeland. Oh, no, absolutely not. Us Brits can't have our country back, as they put it. You know, that when he said that, it really summed up just how bourgeois and smug Glastonbury has become. Because who is that aimed at? That's aimed at reform voters. Yeah. That's aimed at the largely working class people who have been betrayed time after time by the Labour Party, who are looked down upon with utter contempt by the media establishment, who are viewed as gammon, as the scum of the earth, as obese and lazy and feckless and Europhobic and xenophobic. It's that class of people that he is looking down upon as well. So this wasn't rock and roll rebellion. No. This was snobbery dressed up as punk.
But it was hilarious, wasn't it? You even had, you know, the big upset was going to be about Kneecap. Then you've got Jade from Little Mix, for goodness sake, who, by the way, many years ago blocked me on Twitter when I did suggest they put their clothes back on at some point, given that all their fans are 12-year-old girls. But she went on stage and she was saying, yeah, join me in a chant. You know, it was F, you know, F smelly toilets, F reform, F, you know, genocide. I mean, it was so trite and embarrassing. And then calls for people to boycott Rod Stewart as the headliner of Sunday Tea Time Act because he'd said that he'd give reform a chance. And it was like, that crowd was absolutely packed out and everyone was having a wonderful time. Far more people chanting, I have to say, you know, I am sailing. And if you think you're sexy, than they were death to the IDF. What about the people who would say to you, as John just said, who's a caller, you know, these are hurty words. They're not nice words. They come from a position of hate. I don't want to hear them, but people have a right to say them. No one should be prosecuted for saying them. No one should be prosecuted for broadcasting them. Lots of calls for the BBC chief to face prosecution. Ofcom even shouldn't be censuring people exercising their right to freedom of speech. What would you say to that?
You know, I agree with all of that. My question is why it doesn't apply equally to everyone. That's the underlying question here. I'm a free speech absolutist. So even though I thought Bob Vylan behaved awfully, and even though I think it was an incredibly bigoted, fascistic cry, and I'm disgusted by the audience that joined in with it, I still wouldn't want to see prosecutions. I do think we have to defend freedom of speech, even when it's speech that we find really ugly and really horrible.
But it was incitement to violence. There's a difference, is there not? And you can say, even in America, the law is new. Yeah. There has to be, their threshold is much, much higher than any threshold we've ever had in law here. But there must be a threshold in terms of you can't incite people to violence. Is your argument that he wasn't actually expecting people in that audience to put their Palestinian flags down, get on a plane straight from Glasgow and head over to try and kill IDF soldiers? Is that so? It's not really incitement. But then then did people really think that people might see Lucy Connolly's tweet that was up for a few hours last July and they would suddenly decide, yeah, you know what, I think I will go and set fire to an asylum hotel?
Exactly right. You know, I don't think what he did was, strictly speaking, incitement, because it didn't have that imminent nature to it. I don't think there was an imminent prospect of any of those people in the audience who were probably off their heads on drugs or drink or something else, that they were going to look for an IDF soldier to take out. And by the way, good luck to them if they even thought they could do that. But so I don't think it was an imminent act of incitement. But you're absolutely right. The same can be said for Lucy Connolly. The idea that anyone saw her briefly lived post, which she herself regretted and which everyone agrees was obnoxious, the idea that anyone saw that and acted on it is preposterous. So my solution to our undoubted system of two-tier justice is not to jail everyone who says awful things, but to not jail anyone who says awful things. And at the moment, in Keir Starmer's Britain, it seems you can say things that are in line with the fashionable politics, but you can't say things like Lucy Connolly said. So that is an unequal system.
Wouldn't we just rather that neither of them said those things? I mean, again, I think people should be able to reserve the right, especially when they're forced by law to pay the BBC licence fee. I think people should be entitled to watch a live stream or a recording of a pop act, you know, a rap act, I mean, punk rapper, whatever the hell they think they are, at a music festival, and not be subjected to violent political chants. Is that unreasonable? I mean, I like, you know, people carrying their Palestinian flags. Again, my favourite flag, and it's there every year at Glastonbury, is a big flag, which is always at the pyramid stage, with blocking your view since 2002. And it makes me chuckle every single year. But can't we, surely the thing that I think most people in this country would be united by would be a view that, could we please have music and sport without politics? No armbands, no rainbow laces, no Palestinian flags, no lectures, no death chants. Could we just be allowed to have a little bit of fun, or a little bit of sport, a little bit of music, without being sodding well lectured every time?
Lectured and looked down upon and regaled with these obnoxious neo-fascistic chants for the death of Jewish soldiers. Absolutely. If only we could live in that world. I think there are definitely questions for the BBC to answer, because, you know, as I was saying earlier, the seriousness of this cannot be overstated, which is that this was a borderline, violent, almost fascist rally. That's what it felt like, a mob of people crying for death to the army of the Jewish nation, and the BBC broadcast it live into millions of homes. That is an incredibly serious matter. So anyone who just brushes this aside and says, it's all about free speech, I love free speech, but that's not enough. We do have to talk about how this happened and what's going on.
But I mean, look, we know this is the latest, you know, interest of the people on, you know, the woke left. They've moved on a bit from the whole eco thing. And of course, all those people who are obsessed with the eco thing will all have had their plastic bottles. They'll have left their disposable tents there. They care not a jot when they left this morning. It's all a load of a performative nonsense anyway. But, you know, the Palestine cause is now the latest, you know, Gaza, the latest big, you know, fad. The BBC, though, has got a lot of highly paid executives, paid for by you and me, although not by, I think, was it John, who doesn't pay his licence fee, who just called in. Increasingly, a lot of people don't, because they're so angry about some of the coverage. But they have a duty of, you know, of care, of responsibility in the same way. You know, Ofcom is in charge of all broadcasters. We know that Ofcom is now going to be investigating the BBC over this. Senior executives, there was the warning over kneecap. The Prime Minister weighed in on it. He shouldn't be performing, shouldn't be broadcast live. Decided not to broadcast that live, but they put this act on, Bob Vylan on live, even though they knew. Anyone who said, let's put Bob Vylan on a live broadcast, they would have known the singer's views. They would have known where they stood. They would have known about the language and everything. So they chose to do that. When the first death to the IDF was shouted, they chose not to cut the feed and go to another one of the many, I mean, what, there are like 7 or 8 stages now they were taking live feeds from. They chose not to do that. Those are editorial decisions. Do you agree with me that part of the reason why the editorial decision was not made to cut that feed was because the BBC is institutionally anti-Semitic. They don't see it, they don't hear it. It is so ingrained in their thinking as an institution, they don't even realise. So when I questioned a very, very senior BBC executive about this and challenged him a week or so ago, he was genuinely, I think, morally outraged that I should have questioned this stance of the BBC and denied it. I was outrageous for me to say it. And I said, you're all so ingrained with it, you don't even know you're doing it. Do you think that's an issue?
Absolutely. I completely agree with that. I think that is the reason they didn't press the off button, which they would have done if it had been any other kind of offensive chant. Imagine someone was chanting, you know, trans women are men or something. They would be like, oh my God, let's switch it off. Yeah. So yes, I think that's why. And you know what? The fact that they're so defensive when people like you and others call out the anti-Semitism that exists there, that in itself is interesting, because it's all the rage these days for institutions to admit that they have a problem with racism, to admit that they're too white, they're too male, pale, stale, that we don't treat ethnic minorities well enough. And they love to self-flagellate over their own failings on the race question. But when you mention the fact that they might be anti-Semitic, they hunker down. They say, no way, you're wrong. The defensiveness gives them away. The double standard gives them away. But you know what, Julia? Yesterday in Gaza, a young British lad was killed. A guy called Yisrael Nathan Rosenfeld. He was 20 years old. He was in the IDF. He was killed by Hamas, that army of anti-Semites that wants to destroy the Jewish state. Just think about this. In Glastonbury, a field of people, privileged kids, were shouting death to the IDF at the exact same time. You know who else was either saying that or thinking it? Hamas. And they killed this young British lad. So tell me, who's the real anti-fascist there? Those idiots at Glastonbury, or that brave hero who went into Gaza to fight for his country? I think I know the answer to that question.
Absolutely. Just finally, look, the Prime Minister weighed in on this. He's weighing in. He's finally got back from all his foreign jaunts and weighing in on the welfare reform debate. He says he regrets, you know, various things he said about like us being an island of strangers. He's had the U-turn on. I mean, the U-turns are just non-stop, aren't they? We had the winter fuel allowance U-turn. That was a good thing. Rape gangs inquiry U-turn. Now the disability benefits U-turn, there may even be more coming to child benefit cap, you name it. Probably going to have a U-turn on the tax pledge. He's going to get taxes in the autumn as well. This is the Prime Minister not even finishing his first year in office. That'll be on Saturday, the anniversary of him becoming Prime Minister, and he's already lost all authority. Do you think he lasts till the end of his term?
I think he won't, and I really hope he won't. What a pathetic excuse for a prime minister. You know, think back to the lady is not for turning. Now, people might be pro-Thatcher or anti-Thatcher. That's their business. But she knew how to stand her ground. You can't have a prime minister who, he's not even a weather vane. It's an insult to weather vanes to call it the weather vane. This is the guy who will just put all his so-called principles on the bonfire if he thinks it will help him keep his position in number 10. He's a coward, and it's institutional cowardice with him, and it just means that he's a really bad leader and the country deserves better.
Absolutely. Amen to that. Brendan O'Neill, Chief Political Writer at Spiked Online. Always good to talk to you. Thank you so much. Brief word from Sam Armstrong.
Yeah, this Prime Minister is just the weakest of any I can remember in so long. It's spineless. It's jelly-like. It's supine. There is nothing there to him whatsoever. And you kind of got a question, really. What is the point? Because actually, it is quite difficult to be Prime Minister in a number of ways. It's a horrible job. Your life is poured over. He's obviously had a family member being attacked. Inordinate pressures. You're constantly switched on. I totally get why you would do that if you actually want to achieve something, if you actually want to get something done. But if you don't care, if you're just as happy to cut this or not cut it,
you just want to be PM.
I really, really don't understand people like that.
No, absolutely. Again, I just don't think he has a single. I don't think that he's sort of, you know, morally waving in the wind. I don't think he's ever had any views at all that he wouldn't sell, you know, for one more vote in Parliament. 10:48 is the time. I'd love to hear your thoughts on all of that.